Here's the lecture to key issue 4. Why do farmers face economic difficulties? And I don't love the title of this that your book gives it because this is broader than that. This is really the section on the challenges facing agriculture in more developed countries and less developed countries. In developing countries or less developed countries, as you might imagine, the challenges are greater. Subsistence farmers have to feed an increasing number of people because of rapid population growth in developing countries. Food supply does increase through intensification of production via new farming methods and leaving land fallow for shorter periods of time. So remember, leaving land fallow is where you just leave that land alone and you don't grow food on it and you allow it time to rejuvenate and get nutrients back into the soil so that you can then use it again. Well, better agricultural practices as well as use of technology allow farmers in less developed countries to leave land fallow for shorter periods. Look at the population growth. You can see right away how much more of a challenge less developed countries have feeding their growing populations than countries like the United States or Europe. I mean, those in Europe. Here we have a picture in the bottom left of an Afghan man standing in a field of poppies, which, although they're beautiful, are used to make opium or synthesized for heroin, which is one of the worst killers of all drugs. And in the right, you have some young Colombian boys working on a coca farm, which produces the coca leaf and is made into cocaine, another extremely dangerous drug. Drug crops are unfortunately popular for farmers in the developing countries because there's high demand in more developed countries. High demand means high price. And they're especially popular in countries that have proximity to MDCs because that's where the market is. And so this is often a crop that you'll find in countries near Europe or in countries near America. We already talked about how it may be difficult for a small-time farmer in an LDC to compete with a big plantation that's selling, say, bananas. Just the fact that their farm isn't as big, they can't produce as much, they can't sell it for as low of a price. It's going to be hard for them to even compete and even make money. But it's not all about money. Think about this. You've got a Honduran man living in a remote area. How does he make banana growing profitable if the harvest is going to go bad before he can get it to a distributor or before that distributor can get it to the market? He's not going to be able to sell his crop if the crop's just going to go bad by the time it gets to the consumer. And drug crops are non-perishable, and the trafficker will come right to the farm gate to get them. So part of the problem is there may not be enough infrastructure for farmers to get other crops to market on time. So where we will see this change, hopefully, is where countries become more developed. They put in more roads. They have their own better police force to prevent this, but also there has to be an incentive for a farmer to be willing to grow something else. They have to actually be able to make money on it. I kind of ran out of space, but I would have put a picture of weed farms up here because marijuana farms are just kind of the same story here. And while these two drug crops are among the most dangerous, people always talk about how weed can't hurt you, can't kill you. But if you're living near the US border and you're caught up in the cartel violence, it can, because these giant drug cartels become very powerful in the illicit dealing of drugs to the market in the United States, drugs like marijuana, and they run whole communities in Mexico and other South American countries, or other Central American countries. And they run these communities through bribery and intimidation. So when someone says, oh, it's not a big deal, well, it is a big deal if you don't know where you're getting that. One, you're breaking the law, but two, you could be helping to support these cartels which are murdering people. It's just crazy. What about challenges for farmers in developed countries? Now, there are some farmers that do really, really well. You saw the videos of these large-scale farms, and you have to imagine these farms are producing a good profit. Well, just about 10% of the farms in the US are large commercial farms, those real big ones that I was just mentioning. Those don't struggle. It's very easy for a farmer with such a big operation to have a $200,000 salary. But there are a lot of smaller farmers around the country. They're commercial, but they're not on that large scale. And some of them do struggle. Some of them do have a hard time pushing a profit. Part of the reason for this is overproduction. This sounds crazy. Um, they're producing so much, it seems like they should be able to sell it all and make even more money than if they're producing less. But because they can produce so much more food than is demanded by consumers, the demand is stagnant. And that demand is stagnant because there's low population growth, right? Remember, low population growth in more developed countries. And this wouldn't really be a problem if there's only one farmer, because that farmer could put an artificial limit on the supply. He could say, oh, I'm only going to sell this much, so I'm going to be able to sell it for this price. But that's not the case. Another farmer is going to, have to try to sell as much as they can so it's not going to waste. And that competition between farmers plus all the excess production means that prices are going to go down. Now that's great for us as a consumer, but it's not necessarily good for the farmer, and it might not be good for the economy overall, because that farmer is less likely to buy more equipment, which is not going to support John Deere, which is putting less money into the Tennessee economy, because John Deere is located here in Tennessee, which of course is going to mean Tennessee doesn't have as much money to put in education, and that means fewer opportunities for students. You can take this down a whole long path, and of course that's all conjecture, but it's worth considering. Now, your book paints the picture that farmers in general have low incomes. That's really not true. I've done a good deal of research trying to really figure out what the average salary of the American farmer is, and it's difficult because farmers have to pay themselves. And they might have a great year for 10 years and have a lot of money, but then for another 8 years, their farms are barely making a profit. Sometimes farms don't make a profit when you have to consider all that they have to pay for, all the kind of expenses they have. Remember, they're often commercial agriculture takes use of this system. So they're having to employ people, they're having to hire someone to come harvest, they're going to have to hire someone to fly a plane. and crop dust. They're having to hire possibly the bee trucking guys. There's a lot of expenses that modern farmers have. The US government has foreign policies that attempt to address this excess production. Farmers are encouraged to avoid producing crops that are in excess supply. The government pays farms when certain commodity prices are low. The government buys surplus production and sells or donates it to foreign governments. So the US government is heavily involved in agriculture. And there are certainly people who are against this, and there are others who are not against the government being involved, but they wish that instead of the government giving tax breaks or incentives to, say, corn farmers, which continues the process of corn being used to make sweeteners and fillers and all kind of things to put in our processed food. Many wish that the government would put money into trying to create a healthier lifestyle. So maybe promoting those foods that are more healthy. Another challenge is locating the production of food in close enough proximity to markets. Geographers use the von Thunen model to help explain the importance of proximity in the choice of crops on commercial farms. So you may have heard me mention or you've read about the rings. So when you think of the von Thunen model, picture a target, like a bow and arrow target, a bullseye in the middle, that's the city, and then these rings around it, which would theoretically represent the different kind of farms you would find. And it's all about how far it is away from the city. Now, in a real world situation, land is not always flat. The city's not always right in the middle of all the agriculture. There might be some other physical feature that gets in the way. For instance, a mountain. If you have a city right next to a mountain, you're not going to have these rings all the way around. People are going to get their resources from the other side, not the mountainside. But it's a theory, so it's theoretical. Farms located closer to market tend to select crops with higher transportation costs per hectare of output, whereas more distant farms are more likely to select crops that can be transported less expensively. So what's going to make transportation expensive? Well, if the product is heavy or if the product requires refrigeration, that's going to be a greater expense. It used to be that something like milk, which is still in the first ring, had to be really close to the city so that that milk could be taken to the consumer before it went bad. But now with refrigeration and advancements in the production of milk, they don't have to be so close. But they still want it to be close because they're going to have to refrigerate it. They don't want to have to pay for all the energy it would take to refrigerate milk on a day-long journey or a 2-day journey. The second ring is items more difficult to transport, like wood. Like I said, how heavy it is, how bulky it is, that's going to also factor into the difficulty and the cost of transportation. The third ring is going to be various crops and pasture lands. And the fourth ring, spacious land for animal grazing. Another thing to consider besides, is the food going to spoil by the time we get it there, is how much does the land cost? The closer you are to a city, in most cases, the higher the value of the land. So you got to be able to do something that A, either really requires you being close to the city, or B, is uh, worthwhile, is actually going to give you a good profit. Like I said, you're not going to set up a ranch in Collierville because that land is worth too much money. That land could be used for agriculture because it's good land, but it's not even going to be used for agriculture because it's still worth too much for that, right? It's going to be used for houses and new subdivisions. Let's look at some strategies for increasing the world's food supply. There are 4 strategies being employed in order to distribute food to everyone in the world. And when we say distribute, we mean distribute the production, not just, okay, America's going to make all the grains for everybody. Y'all come and get them. We'll talk in a minute about why that may not work, why that might not be helpful. It's not really possible, but when you see all the food that we throw away, you have to ask that question, why aren't we just giving this away? Well, one, we are, but there's another element to this, which we'll talk about in a minute. One of these is increasing exports from countries with surpluses. Okay, what I was just mentioning, those countries that have extra, they can export it to other places. Expanding the land area used for agriculture. Expanding fishing. Increasing the productivity of land now used for agriculture. This is an important map. This shows the principal flow of agriculture in the world is from Western Hemisphere to Europe and Asia. Australia is another net exporter. Being so large but not having a massive population to have to feed, Australia can afford to export a lot. Australia is also in a very nice position to be able to export things like beef and lamb to a growing middle class market in China and other parts of East Asia. As you see, the US is a net exporter of $10 billion worth of food and above. Other South American countries export a lot. It's interesting. You get over to Europe, and there are some countries that do a lot of exporting, and there's some that have to import. Okay, what about expanding agricultural land? If the problem is there's not enough food, well, why not make more farms? Unfortunately, today, few scientists believe that further expansion of agricultural land can feed the growing world population. Part of the reason for this is that the good land is already being used. Farmland in some regions is being abandoned for lack of water. Other land degradation that makes land resemble a desert-like state, which is caused by humans often, is known as desertification. Now, it's not always caused by humans. It can be caused by drought, but it's definitely caused by deforestation. So when humans cut down trees for use in fuel or building, or again, like we said before, for grazing, or overcultivation. If unsustainable farming practices are used, people get all the nutrients out of the land, or they suck too much moisture out of the land, they can dry it up, and this can lead to the expansion of the desert. In North Africa, we've seen a growing expansion of the Sahara Desert. It is slowly creeping further south into the Sahel region. And this is obviously not good because we know the desert's really useless to us, besides the resources we may get from it. Human beings do not thrive in the desert. So the idea of just making more farms, it might not work very well, at least on a large scale. Now, if you look around your city, you may say, there's a lot of kind of places here that we could actually grow food. We could grow food on rooftops. We could grow food in parks. We could grow food around the city more, where people just have a bunch of land that are doing nothing with it. What about the area along the interstate? Why can't we grow land there? So this is worth thinking about, but again, most scientists don't see it as being the future of agriculture. Land devoted to agriculture has remained virtually unchanged since 1990, whereas population has increased by more than 50%. This is pretty astounding. You see the red line where our population has gone up exponentially, but we don't have more farms. In fact, we might even have less farms because some of those smaller farms have been bought up and turned into big farms. But as far as the overall land we're using, we haven't increased it that much. Now, this is a good thing. This means that we've gotten a lot better at producing more food on the same amount of land. Okay, a food supply that people a lot of times don't think about because it doesn't really fit into our understanding of agriculture is uh, fishing as well as aquaculture. Aquaculture, also known as aqua farming, is the cultivation of seafood under controlled conditions. So a lot of times this happens in what are called fisheries. Sometimes those are netted off areas of the ocean. Sometimes those are basically giant swimming pools uh, with filters and teams that are charged with ensuring that these fishes are healthy. So if you go buy fish, you can look at it and it will either say fresh caught or farmed. And of course, you know fishing is the capture of wild fish and other seafood. This is kind of interesting. Only 2/3 of the fish caught from the ocean is consumed directly by humans. That figure used to be a lot higher, but one of the things that accounts for a chunk of fishing or fish uh, production that goes toward non-human consumption is chickens. I don't remember the figures on this, but Chile produces um, a great deal of chicken feed that is made partially of sardines. And it's just a way of getting protein into the chicken's diet instead of the chicken just eating grain. And as our chicken consumption has increased dramatically, as we've mechanized that, that has also had an effect on the fishing industry. We often talk about how good fish is for you, especially certain types of fish, high in omega-3s, good source of protein, good source of good fats. But overfishing is a concern expressed by the UN. They estimate that a quarter of fish stocks have been overfished and half have been fully exploited, leaving only a quarter underfished. Total world fish catch has remained relatively constant since the 1980s despite population growth. So we are fishing a lot, but it's not we're not fishing more than we used to, which is probably a good thing because we need to let some of those fish stocks heal, basically. Let them regrow in numbers and increase our supply so that it can be sustainable. This is kind of interesting. It shows human consumption of fish has increased in both developed and developing regions. And yet, what I just said in the last slide was that the uh, amount of fish that were caught has remained constant. So how could this both be possible? Well, you probably figured it out. We're doing more fish farming now. So we're not necessarily catching more fish out in the open ocean, but we are farming more, and so our consumption has gone up. You see that consumption in developing countries has greatly increased, and consumption in the developed countries has remained relatively constant. Does this mean that people in developing countries like fish more than we do? Well, perhaps in some places, but no, there's more people who live in developing countries. So there's greater population there, which just means the numbers in millions of metric tons are going to be higher. And we see an increase there that probably mirrors population increase, which we know is happening virtually completely in the developing countries. Okay, the big way in which we increase the food supply is increasing productivity. This is what has actually worked in the past and what is working today. The invention and rapid diffusion of more productive agriculture techniques in the 70s and 80s is called the Green Revolution. In the Green Revolution, they introduced new higher yield seeds, not GMOs. So you'll hear about GMOs, genetically modified organisms. That is a seed, that is a plant that has been modified on a genetic level in a lab. But what you have to know is that human beings for thousands of years have been doing something called crossbreeding. And I'm not an expert in this, but they take favorable traits and they try to get those traits to be the ones that are carried on. So if you have an orange tree and one branch of the orange tree has the biggest and the most delicious oranges, and this other branch, it's okay, but it's not so good. Which seeds are you going to want to use? Well, you're definitely going to want to use the better one because it's more likely that the next tree that you plant from those seeds is going to have those favorable results. And so it's really not that complicated, but when you get into crossbreeding, it gets a little more complex. But what you need to know is that they're using better seeds. And this is possible because of cooperation between countries. Now, one country, especially LDC, the farmers are just going to keep doing things the way that their ancestors did them. But when someone comes in and says, hey, we have a slightly better way of doing this, would you like to try it? That can make a huge difference. The other really big part of the Green Revolution was the expanded use of fertilizers. So the fertilizers allowed land to be used consistently without farmers having to leave it fallow. And these seeds that were produced are seeds that were engineered to work with the fertilizers. So they're kind of special seeds in that regard. The Green Revolution was largely responsible for preventing food crises in South Asia, in Mexico, and part of East Asia during the 70s and 80s. And the Green Revolution allowed productivity to outpace population growth. Remember, that was one of the great fears way back by that guy Malthus, who said population increase is going to outpace food production and people are going to starve. Well, the Green Revolution disproved that. There was a miracle wheat seed that was passed around, a miracle rice seed. It was huge in preventing people, especially in India, from starving. And miracle high yield maize corn was produced in Mexico, and that's really what where the Green Revolution started. Here we see that the population of the world has increased less rapidly than food production. A little bit of history about this. The Green Revolution, really, like any revolution, was possible because of a lot of people. But this one guy, Borlaug, was a farmer and a scientist, and he went down to Mexico to experiment with this kind of stuff and had a lot of success there, and then went to other places like Pakistan and India and was able to help stop these impending famines. So he was given the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, this guy Norman Borlaug, and credited with saving over 1 billion people from starvation just by involving, just by developing these higher yield varieties of cereal grains, also expanding irrigation infrastructure. You know, if a farmer's just having to wait around for it to rain, it's not going to be very productive. But if you can get water to your crops, then you can dramatically increase your food supply. So the other part of the third agricultural revolution, which we're of course in right now, is the gene revolution. So gene revolution has two parts. One is giving hormones and antibiotics to animals. So if you're trying to raise animals, whether it is dairy cows for milk, so you can make cheese and yogurt and all kinds of stuff, and of course drink milk, or if it is animals for meat, these hormones can increase their development, and that's pretty controversial. But antibiotics can also be used to keep them from getting sick. You know, if quite a few of your animals that you're raising die, that's going to dramatically decrease your food supply. But if you can keep them healthy and alive with antibiotics, you are likely to have greater success. Now, even antibiotics are controversial because some people say we wouldn't need these antibiotics if we weren't doing large-scale mechanized agriculture. In 2011, Chinese scientists generated dairy cows genetically engineered with genes from human beings to be able to produce milk that would be the same as human breast milk. This is weird, right? The researchers claim these transgenic cows to be identical to regular cows. 2 months later, scientists from Argentina presented Rosita, a transgenic cow incorporating 2 human genes to produce milk with similar properties as human breast milk. And in 2012, researchers from New Zealand also developed a genetically engineered cow that produced allergy-free milk. So there's great promise here, but there are also moral questions to ask. There are moral implications to this. How much can we change before we start causing problems? Before we start crossing some boundaries that we're not sure if we really need to cross? Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of time to delve into that. But if you're fascinated by it, there's a whole bunch of stuff out there that you can find out. The other part of the Green Revolution, the gene revolution, is GMOs. These are genetically modified organisms. So these are plants that have been modified in a lab to grow faster, to be more hardy, to produce more yields, and to overall increase the food supply. Now, some countries like the United States, Canada, China don't have a problem with GMOs. In fact, we think that they are really the future. Now, certainly not everyone here, which is why we have so many people buying organic. But GMOs do allow us to produce a great deal of crops with less use of pesticides, and that is one of the perceived benefits of them. Right. Okay, so we already talked about how rice production, wheat, and corn production were increased, how it reduced famines. So the impact has been huge as far as preventing hunger. And the largest impact has been had in places where rice is produced. India, like I said, was on the brink of a massive famine. Now there are some problems with the Green Revolution. It requires a heavy use of fresh water. So if you're pumping in water, you have to get that water from somewhere, and that could have an effect on the natural ecology of the region. And there's also high dependency on technology and machinery. Now that machinery is sold by core countries. So Green Revolution could make less developed countries more dependent on MDCs. And also that machinery takes money. If you don't have that money, you might be borrowing that money from MDCs, and that makes you even more dependent. It also requires a heavy use of pesticides and fertilizer. Remember, we're talking right now about the Green Revolution. The promise of the Gene Revolution is that if you're using these genetically modified organisms, you won't have to use as much pesticide or fertilizer. But that has not been adopted everywhere. And you have reduced genetic diversity and increased blight, fire, insect disease, vulnerability, especially if you're doing monoculture. You could have a situation where a particular insect burrows into your crop and reproduces and spreads and takes over your whole crop. And little success has been had in the least developed area of the world, in Africa, where corruption and infrastructure problems are limiting factors. And another strategy to increase the world's food supply could be making agriculture more sustainable. These are agricultural practices that preserve and enhance environmental quality. Three principal practices distinguish sustainable agriculture. Sorry, I don't know why that says picture. And at its best, organic farming from conventional agriculture. So organic farming we'll talk about, but organic farming is really just a brand. Now, I don't mean a brand like it's one company, but all these farmers have gotten together and over the past 20 years, have created this label, organic, which means they have to adhere by some pretty strict rules. They can't cut many corners, and it's just a word, really. Anything that has life is organic, so it's kind of a silly word, but that's the one that was chosen. But three things that are involved in sustainable agriculture: sensitive land management, limited use of chemicals, and better integration of crops and livestock. where crops and livestock are being used together, hand in hand. The figure here shows the distribution of organic farming. You see that Australia accounts for nearly 1/3 of the world's organic farming. To wrap things up, so as we think back on agriculture, here are some thoughts to make sure that we have a good understanding. Prior to the development of agriculture, people survived by hunting animals, gathering wild vegetation, and fishing. Current agricultural practices vary between developed and developing countries. Everyone needs food to survive, right? So the amount of food and dietary composition of the food vary between developed and developing countries. Most people in developing countries are subsistence farmers, means they're just feeding themselves. Commercial farming is primarily practiced in developed countries. This is all common sense. And lastly, farmers face many challenges to meeting the dietary needs of a rapidly growing population when they are forced to rely on poorer quality land to farm as a result of land degradation processes and suburban sprawl taking away farmland. So that last sentence there, we didn't talk a lot about that, but we did mention the other day, like in California, where you have this prime farmland, but people want to live there. So as more people have moved out of the cities over the last 50 years, they have taken up more land, bigger backyard, bigger house, and that's land that could have been used for farmland. So we actually have less farmland, less good farmland available than we have in the past. Went through all that kind of fast, so if there are any questions, please write them down, bring them to class, and we'll get every question answered.